I'm happy to be part of this event and talk a little bit about how these maps are helping to inform conservation in the Caribbean. I am the lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy's Caribbean division, and I've been working on mapping and protecting mangroves, coral reefs, and seagrass for about 20 years now. And the new technologies that are coming about in the last 10, 15 years have been really beneficial for us to be able to map the extent of these habitats, map their condition, and look at the change that is happening, especially when we have hurricanes and other events that can impact these systems. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're doing this and some of the impact that it's having, and not get so much in the technical part. You've heard about from Frithof the techniques that we've used to map, but I'm going to provide kind of an overview. And so the Nature Conservancy, we're a nonprofit organization. We work in about 70 countries. And this week, there's actually the UN Ocean Conference that's going on in Lisbon. And we have several representatives that are working with governments around the world on protecting the ocean. Now, the ocean covers about 70% of the Earth's surface. It's home to about 80% of all life. It generates half of the oxygen we breathe, and it absorbs about 20 to 30% of the carbon dioxide. So it's really important to manage and protect. And of course, there's the biodiversity that coral reefs, although they cover only about 1% of the ocean, they're home to about 25% of all marine species. So these are systems that are really important to protect. But they're meeting this week to make decisions on protection and advance goals. And we work very closely with governments around the world. I work with about 17 countries and territories in the Caribbean to expand marine protection. And a lot of our work that we do is found at caribbeanscienceatlas.tnc.org, where we show what we're mapping, we describe why we're mapping it and some of the techniques, but much of our efforts and our progress can be found here at this ArcGIS story map. And just to give you an example, we're working with all these governments to track protection. And a lot of this is done in the World Database on Protected Areas, but we work very closely with the governments to help them gazette their protected areas and track where they are in terms of their goals. Many of the countries are striving towards 30% protection by 2030, and we're tracking that. And that protection can come in a variety of formats. There's different types of management that can happen over an ocean. There's multi-use. There's different categories that may be specific to certain species. Bahamas recently declared a shark sanctuary across the entire exclusive economic zone. There's several countries that have declared marine mammal sanctuaries. And so these protections come in different shapes and sizes. But one exciting news was the Bahamas. We've been working a lot with them lately to expand their protection to 20%. And they recently declared a number of new sites, and the maps that we're producing helps inform where we need to protect, because we're looking at not only area, but we're trying to make this the most efficient as possible in terms of determining how these systems deliver benefits to people. So we're looking at connections between nature and people. So coral can provide tourism benefits, that can provide coastal protection. and mangroves can provide fisheries benefits. Mangroves can also provide tourism benefits. They also absorb storm impacts. And so the models and the maps that we create are very important for informing and answering the question, what 20% do we need to protect? And the answer to that question is, well, it's those important areas that are providing multiple benefits, not only to people, but are also harboring biodiversity. And so we run models and we use all this information to help inform the selection of these sites. And so these data sets are collected at a variety of scales. We have global models, and we do global assessments with our global science team. I work at the regional and the national level, but I also work at the local level where we do monitoring of these reefs using drones. And at the global, there's certain satellites we can use. At the regional, Frithof talked about how we use the Dove satellite imagery. There's national maps where we get more accurate satellite information. And then at the local level, we can collect information at the drone and underwater. And so these all work together, collecting satellite information, collecting information from planes. I'll talk a little bit about that. Collecting information from drones and also surface drones that we've been working on, and also divers underwater can collect information that informs what's going on at the polyp level when we're looking at coral. We're experiencing a number of different issues with coral, and they need to be studied at all these scales to understand the big picture. And so these maps that we've produced with the help of Tama Group are put on a website at caribbeanmarinemaps.tnc.org, and we've reached many users across the Caribbean. They've been downloading and using these maps to make decisions, and we're trying to improve them at different scales where possible. We get local knowledge. We've been publishing on this information, providing the results to a variety of our partners. All this information was derived from a image-based map that Frithof mentioned that consisted over 38,000 scenes that were color balanced using a color target. The MODIS sensor was used to be able to balance across scenes and make it so we had a seamless data set, a 4-band seamless data set to work with. And we had to identify what habitats were actually possible to map, given the limitations of the sensor with 4 bands, a certain radiometric quality. And so we really had to get a lot of ground truth data and try to understand what the data could support in terms of extracting these habitat types. And these are some examples here. So if we look at an example of the Dove imagery, here we can see an area, the raw image RGB, and then the resulting classification. We ended up with 13 classes, and this process took over 2 years to do across the whole Caribbean. It was a very ambitious effort, but we were able to succeed. Working with Ralph and Frithof to deliver the products using eCognition server, and they've really been beneficial for a number of uses. And you can see here that the previous maps that we used were based on global products using a 30-meter resolution, and you can see the footprint of the coral reef in orange. And then our new maps provide much richer context, and we're able to identify those very small coral patches and actually divide the coral into different types because they provide different benefits, such as the coral rim, the front and back reef have different biodiversity niches, and we really wanted to map these out and make them available to our partners. But we've also been working on developing live coral maps, and this is something that we weren't able to do with the planet data, but we've been working with Arizona State University and Greg Asner to collect imaging spectroscopy, and with over 400 bands, we're correlating the images that we collect underwater with high precision GPS, and really be able to map the presence of live coral in certain areas that we're interested in. And this has been really beneficial for understanding what the condition of the reef is, how it's changing over time, and how to implement management and restoration activities. And we can get not only live coral, but we can predict depth, and we can get things like reef structure and rugosity. And all this information is really valuable for a number of things, looking at the coral protection benefits, looking at the tourism value. We're actually looking at how to restore reefs so that we minimize beach erosion, which is a big concern in areas like the Dominican Republic and the Punta Cana area, where they rely heavily on tourism dollars. We're looking at this for identifying areas where we restore coral, where coral is being grown both in the water and on land facilities, and then that coral is transplanted to certain areas on the reef. And ultimately, this information contributes to marine spatial planning, where we're working with countries to zone the ocean in regards to certain objectives, whether it be tourism, whether it be marine protection, biodiversity protection, fisheries management, or things like that. And one of the exciting things that we've recently finished, finished this only a few months ago, was we took the coral data that was generated with the TAMA group, and we created a coral refugia model. We looked at things like thermal events, past and modeled future. We looked at connectivity, and we tried to identify those areas that are more likely going to be resilient going into the future. And these are areas that we should really focus on and work with governments to protect. So here's a picture of one of our colleagues planting the coral that's been grown in a nursery onto the reef. And we're monitoring these sites. We use things like structure from motion to be able to monitor these, create 3D point clouds from stereo photos, and then be able to track over time how that coral is changing. We can monitor growth and erosion of coral, and it's a very powerful way to monitor at the local scale. So that's a little bit about coral reefs. Now I want to talk about mangroves, and we're using this same base map to create a mangrove map because the past global products are just not accurate enough for this national and local scale decision making. There's a lot of narrow and fringing reefs that are being missed. As you can see in the TNC derived there in the bottom right corner, there's much more mangroves that are being mapped than are in the global products, and that's because of the difference in spatial resolution. And here's some examples of some of the work that we've been working with the TAMA group and Frithof to identify these really narrow areas of coral, of mangrove, that will supplement the coral data that we've been mapping. I'm going to zoom into an example. We just got back from a field excursion in Andros Island, which you can see is the largest island in the Bahamas. We're going to zoom in here and kind of show you what's going on. In this field work, we're validating and refining the maps right now, but you can see from the drone image that we have these broadleaf coppice areas that have a transitional ring, and mangroves are really governed by elevation. But since we don't have good elevation data for the Bahamas, we have to rely on the imagery. But you can see the coppice rings that we're able to identify. That's a change in elevation of only a meter or so, where we're transitioning from a mangrove habitat to a broadleaf habitat. And so this information is really helpful to be able to identify those areas of mangroves and coppice, as you can see in the infrared image here. Now these maps were being used as a baseline to detect changes from things like hurricanes, and Hurricane Dorian did significant damage to areas like Grand Bahama in 2019. And these maps are now being used to extract that mangrove footprint and look at changes in the NDVI. And we can use this information to identify where restoration needs to happen, where mangroves are coming back, where they're not, and where human intervention can help restore some of these mangroves. We're also using drones to monitor the comeback in several areas. Here's some images taken by our partners from Perry Marine Institute, looking at some of the areas in Grand Bahama. On the top, we can see a drone image where the mangroves are having a very difficult time recovering from the impacts of the storm. And the images on the bottom show a much greater recovery. Those areas in red are where mangroves, the propagules, are starting to grow back. And we're also developing what's called a Blue Carbon Explorer, where these mangroves maps are going to go into this platform to be able to answer the question of where mangroves and seagrass are stable and they're sequestering carbon. There's a lot of funding that's going into identifying areas of blue carbon markets. And so these maps are directly contributing to protecting mangroves where they are providing that sequestration service, and also identify where are areas of restoration potential and what are the causes and opportunities to restore. So for example, here's an area in Jamaica where a road has been built and has caused hydrology alteration. In the area to the right, we see extensive mangrove die-off. And this area can be restored through putting culverts under the road and trying to restore that hydrology. And we're also working with coastal communities that are vulnerable to sea level rise and climate change to identify areas of restoration where we're running storm models and looking at what those flood impacts would be, and trying to identify areas where it would make economic sense, and also to reduce the vulnerability to plant mangroves and to make the community more climate resilient. And so those are some of the examples of how we're taking this data and using it to make decisions, both to protect these habitats and also to make people less vulnerable, and to maintain those connections between people and nature that are so important in terms of benefits. And I think that's all I have. Thanks for listening to me. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cold, and hope you can understand me, but I'm happy to field any questions.